My great pleasure to introduce our keynote for the evening, Professor Robert Adam. I think it's one of these cases, if I listed off all of your credentials, it would get tedious for everyone. But so I think it suffices to say, we were talking earlier about reasons for optimism. Here we have a walking reason for optimism. Robert has probably, has you established what is now the foremost traditional or classical practice working on both architecture and urbanism. You've worked on a whole string of urban design projects which have defined the way a generation thinks about urban form. And now you're working on the Oxford Place, which was set up as a result of the Roger Scruton's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission to deliver on its legacy. So Robert has achieved a great deal in architecture and urbanism, written a great many books about it, has a great deal to tell us, and I hope you'll join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'll do my best. Effectively, I'm talking about the problem of beauty in architecture, but of course, I can't talk about the problem of beauty in architecture without talking about the problem of beauty generally. I'm going to be very British and be empirical about this. And I'm also going to do it from the point of view of practice, because it's one thing talking about beauty and so on, but I actually got to do it. And I've got to get it through processes, and I've got to get people to pay for it, because I don't pay for it, of course. And also, by the way, I'm not doing what most architects do. I'm not presenting my work. I have a belief that if you actually make an argument to present your work, it's basically compromise. Either it works or not. There are two pieces of my work in here which I will draw attention to merely because they filled a useful spot, and it was much easier on my slide collection. But this is not about my work, it's about principles. So I shall get into it. And so my first slide, to talk about beauty. I've got into trouble with this slide actually before, but I won't tell you why. But one of the ways we talk about beauty, and I don't want to be unduly sort of masculine about this, but I think it also applies to women, is that generally one talks about beautiful women, and even women talk about being beautiful. Men actually generally don't, but never mind, they could do, but I'm not going to, that's another story. But the purpose of this is to talk about a certain amount of variability. On the left is Ellen Terry, who was a great beauty of her time. We would call it rather statuesque now, or possibly, quite substantial. But in about 1900. In the middle is Kate Moss, who famously said, "Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels," and immediately had to apologize for all the anorexics she created by doing that. I think Ellen Terry would have merely regarded her as a starving person and wanted to, give her a decent meal. And on the right, interestingly, is a Libyan folk dancer. Actually, I went to Libya and in the Gaddafi days, and these folk dancers were supplied at regular intervals by Gaddafi. So clearly they weren't just any old folk dancer, and they certainly weren't part of his bodyguard, about which I won't talk about later. But what became very clear was that being very large was a definite requirement of being one of these folk dancers. In fact, they were so large that they couldn't dance very long, they had to sit down shortly. But the whole point of this is that one of those key statements about beauty is clearly variable according to period and culture. One could possibly argue that one out, but I'll get back to this. The other thing is that a certain amount of discussion about beauty as to whether modernists, and I be careful with the word modern and modernists, but let's call it the prevailing architectural establishment, doesn't want to talk about beauty, and therefore it's kind of limited to people who do traditional stuff. It's not really true, actually. This is Raphael Vignoli, talks about beauty and harmony in the city. And this is very ironic, because he won the Carbuncle Cup for the prize for the most ugly building with a high competition. But nonetheless, he believes that what his architecture should actually make cities beautiful. And Will Alsop, actually was a friend of mine, the job of the architect is this beautiful? Well, clearly he thought that building was beautiful. And Will Alsop was very clear about this, is that actually beauty is what he was pursuing. No, we have to be, there's a kind of terminological problem here, because we looked earlier at the fact that that beauty got excised from the way people talked about things as being kind of bourgeois or whatever. But it's quite difficult, this one. It became an unfashionable word. Let's be clear about the word unfashionable word. I shall read you from something from what's called the Councillor's, I'm talking about British planning law now, the Councillor's Companion, which was issued by the government. It's councillors, by the way, are the people who give planning permissions for buildings. In 2017, and when it was talking about the basic consideration of good design, it said it was something that most people will think that looks good and beautiful. That's actually a government document. And of course, what's happened is the word beautiful has suddenly become a word that people want to use. So guess what? All the architects are now claiming their work is beautiful. So we have a kind of, is this beautiful or not? I don't know. But previously, before the word beautiful became fashionable again, they called their work, and these are quotes actually from Pritzker Prizes in the jury summaries, as inspired, poetic, harmonizing, emotional, and visionary. Well, okay, so they didn't want to use the word beautiful, but they got pretty close to it. So be careful about how we use, because we're talking about words here, and we're talking about words and concepts. And clearly, beauty became unfashionable as a word, but actually the idea that things should be poetic, harmonizing, emotional, visionary, etc., didn't go away. But now, of course, what's happened is, because all this stuff's coming out about beauty, people are producing architects of what I would loosely call the mainstream, of which we see illustrations here, are now saying their work is beautiful. So, well, is or not is another matter, but they clearly kind of think it is. Another issue we have, I have a very particular view about this, and this will come up in my book, which of course you will all go and buy, about time and architecture, is one of the favourite words here, is timeless. And just to show you, this is the idea that beauty would be something that's timeless. Well, I have a problem with the word timeless. I think it's a non-word. I think it's completely, it's a meaningless concept. And just to illustrate it, is here the scheme by Michael Graves, early postmodernist, timeless grammar of architecture. Or here we have Toyo Ito, who's described as a creator of timeless buildings. Well, you take your choice, really. But it's another discussion, but I just put timeless aside. It doesn't mean anything. So where do we go to on this, in architectural terms? Well, one thing we can do, of course, is one thing that, in the last 200,000 years, when Homo sapiens has been around, that's not timeless, that's a time period. Some idea of beauty, as I said at the very beginning, is to do with the human body. It is that we perceive that one another are beautiful. And as I say, our common Western vocabulary certainly is it tends to go to women, but it could go to men, doesn't really matter. So, interestingly enough, of course, classical architecture used proportions and the idea that columns and the classical orders derived from the true things of nature, and they were symbolized, or literally, were the human body. And that's an idea we still have with us, actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So when we actually, talking about how people thought about beauty in the past, as there's the ambulatory of Saint-Denis at the top there on the left, and that's in medieval architecture, number was very important. The columns are 12 apostles. I think every altar has a multiple of 3 as you go up to, and so on and so on. Distance was important. So the idea that your beauty was associating you with God, and particularly pilgrimage. So the distances and measurements were very important. Or we could go to Platonic solids, as we got on the top, where a very interesting idea, which I don't think is wrong, is that a very important Greek idea, early Greek idea, was that somehow the universe was mathematical, as a contrary to being mathematics being a useful way of describing the universe and coming up with useful predictions, Actually, the universe was mathematical, and therefore you could define it as mathematical. And so the idea, and the very persistent idea, which I will get to, is that, which mathematicians particularly like, they say the universe is made up of maths. Well, the universe is what it is, and you can describe it with maths, but that's rather different from saying it is maths. A very ancient idea that once you discover that these logical things work, you think that is the defining thing of the universe, and necessarily, possibly, what God delivers to you. The other one, which I don't think we have anymore, is I don't think even fundamentalists believe that is that God is a very big man with a big grey beard. But nonetheless, the idea, actually in the Bible and in Greek mythology, was that man was made in the image of God. So anything you got that was, derived from some ideal human form was therefore divine and therefore had the beauty of divinity. I don't think we have these, maybe some in the audience do, and they can challenge me afterwards and probably attack me, but no, I think generally speaking we don't think that anymore, even if we operate within an area of belief. So we can actually look at human form again, and there's another way of looking at human form, and this is evolutionary theory. And these amuse me slightly. I put them on here because, I had to find a figure of, a modern figure, and these were research projects done. I've actually carefully recorded the sample numbers here, because 40 UK students, Caucasian, heterosexual, ideal bodies from Newcastle University. I don't think the sample's particularly large. It's a bit larger for the beautiful faces, but that's only 100 UK students. I think if you moved anywhere else, it would be different. It doesn't matter. It's the idea somehow that, and I think there's kind of mileage in this actually, but you're really careful with the mileage in this. Is that there is a very strong evolutionary idea that that one of the aspects of beauty is to seek a good person with whom to reproduce or to support you. I'm not going to dwell on evolutionary theory in this too much. I think there's mileage in this, but I'm not going to go too far on it. We know there are certain things we do, like eat far too much, which has a kind of evolutionary basis. But however, I just share that to make the point. There is still the idea that there are beautiful bodies and not beautiful, and this is actually a real problem, actually, because people who have certain disabilities. This is really depressing, actually. Are often insulted in the street. I mean, quite extraordinary. This idea that somehow a good body and a perfect face are extremely important. Just to take this away from females for a moment, of course, this is the Wodowe tribe on the right in Chad, who are very famous that the women choose the men, and the women choose the men at a particular ceremony. And the men make themselves up to look as attractive as possible for the women. It appears a lot of appeared in a lot of papers and so on. And here we are. They jump up and down, and here the men have actually made themselves up. And so obviously I show the peacock, the male peacock, as a sort of evolutionary example. Now Wendy Deng at the bottom, I'm pretty sure didn't choose Rupert Murdoch because he was attractive physically, but there's a very good evolutionary reason for Wendy Deng choosing Rupert Murdoch. So it didn't last very long. I think it lasted about 7 months, but no doubt she got the cash. I mean, this is okay. I mean, this is perfectly understandable in evolutionary terms. But I'm talking about architecture. So where do you take this in architectural terms? Well, it doesn't work terribly well when you get to buildings. Actually, the project on the left is one of my projects, as a matter of fact. It's a folly, but it doesn't matter. It's the best slide I could find to represent the fact you can't really do buildings in human form. So this doesn't really work. So where do you go from there? So the issue with this is that people are desperate, and unfortunately we haven't had too much of this, actually, desperate to find some timeless definition of what is beautiful. And it's very disturbing for people that they haven't got it. So what they've done is they've gone. Well, this is a prevailing thing. And if you go onto the internet and look up the Golden Section or Fibonacci series, there's a whole cult around this. It is really quite extraordinary. They will tell you that actually the pyramids were done with it, and so on and so on. With the golden section, Fibonacci series, which was actually based on a reproduction process, very complicated. And there are very good logical reasons for it producing forms of growth, but I won't go into that. The first time, and this is very interesting, a lot of people don't want to know this, but the first time anyone made any association with the golden section and architecture was in 1854. And there it is, actually. That's the title of the book that Adolf Zeissing produced. I mean, it has the whole story in the title, A New Theory was a Human Body, developed from basic morphology, stayed hitherto unknown, because what will people tell you? It was a secret. Because you can't prove that it actually happened, they'll tell you it was a secret, which is always very suspicious, which permeates the whole of nature and art, etc. So this title is pervaded. So all kinds of stuff comes out of this. I think actually the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo there is clearly intended for a deodorant advertisement, but because his underarm has got extraordinary significance. But all this stuff turns up, all of this analysis of proportions, and they always come up with a golden section. Oddly enough, I happen to have in my pocket something I bought from America, and this is called the Golden Section Finder. And if I open it up, which is a magnetic catch here, I've got a thing, you see, and I can look at you, and I can find golden sections absolutely everywhere. I mean, it's fantastic. So clearly, they exist absolutely everywhere. And people find them everywhere. I mean, and Corbusier found them as well. So the one on the right is Corbusier. So this desperate idea to find something that is objective and will define beauty. And amazing the places you can find it. I'm not quite sure what the Mona Lisa's nose has got to do with her right wrist, but clearly there's something important about that. I'm not quite sure what it is. And I didn't realize that actually God had designed Africa to be confirmed the golden section. So everyone goes around finding it, and it's a cult, basically. And it then gets applied to architecture. It is deeply suspect, actually, because the one on the left doesn't really work. The Parthenon always comes out. This one's got slightly distorted, something in the thing. No, it doesn't matter. Because actually people choose different bits of the Parthenon. So one of it includes the top, and one of it includes the... the thing is, actually, if you're designing a classical building, you tend to take it from the column centres. But never mind, you always find it when you look hard enough. San Pietro in Montorio in Rome, interestingly enough, when they've done it on the bottom golden section, they've chosen the bottom of the cornice, on the top golden section, they've chosen the top of the cornice. So basically, you just keep on finding it, because, it's so vague anyway. But of course, it doesn't work in any proper scientific analysis. Proper scientific analysis, you'd find out if something else worked just as well. And funnily enough, a 5:3 rectangle works pretty much just as well. In fact, it would certainly work for those. And one thing we do know is that architects at the time, in any period up to 1854, did work on whole number proportions. So anyway, I think I rubbished the golden. I haven't quite finished rubbishing the golden section, because actually you can put it on plug ugly buildings and guess what you find? The golden section. And you can go on and on and on. It's garbage. Just forget it. So I think effectively what I want to make out of this is that there is no golden thing that will tell you something is beautiful. Beauty is a complex issue. And I'm going to go into some of the difficulties and complexities of it, which may contradict some of the things I said earlier. I think we know that in the Middle Ages, mountains were not really regarded as anything particularly nice. They were just things you put fortresses on to keep people out, or annoying things that stopped you getting from one place to another very easily. However, somewhere in the late 18th, early 19th century, the Romanticism and the Sublime actually had this idea that actually mountains were things that were beautiful and sublime, and you went to them. So, equally well, the countryside, we be careful when we talk about nature, because nature has various forms. Wilder nature is one thing, the hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden is quite another. And so the idea somehow that nature is clearly important, But nonetheless, you can regard nature in very different ways. The wild countryside, I'm not terribly fond of brambles, as a sort of aesthetic experience, because you actually get caught up in them, or nettles for that matter. So you're careful about definition of nature. Certainly in the Middle Ages, nature was important, but it tended to be in enclosed conditions, in controlled conditions. So that's something that actually kind of changes culturally a bit. The other one, ruins, interestingly. In the Middle Ages, ruins were not regarded as anything particularly desirable. They were just broken buildings, and therefore perfectly available for plundering to use for other buildings. So we have manuscript versions of broken buildings, which are just kind of whole buildings fallen down. But at some time, again in the Enlightenment, 18th, 19th century, ruins became rather good things, rather beautiful things. You would go there and they'd be poignant and beautiful and tell you about decay and fit in with landscape and so on and so on. So we can't really say that these things are constants, eternal things about beauty. We also get affected by cultural issues. So on the top left, we have a picture of a slum. The Victorians are very good at taking pictures of slums, but it's not the same street, but it could be. But this street now is a bijou place where you pay an awful lot of money to live there, probably about £1 million to have one of those houses. But when the Victorians took this photograph, this is the place you really did not want to go to. Now, as we regard the buildings as beautiful or not, I'm fairly sure that the people that lived there, not wearing any shoes, and probably 20 people to a dwelling, they didn't actually look at the building and say, I know it's a slum, but God, this is beautiful. Whereas I'm sure the people that bought the bijou residences think, this is really wonderful, I'm living in a beautiful building. The other cultural issue, which is a rather important one currently, is a political one here, is that unfortunately, Hitler, not Mussolini, interesting enough, more complicated, that Hitler, rather like Stalin, and rather like everybody else in the 20s and 30s, was rather fond of classicism. And so now a lot of people, and I can't take this away from them, it's just the way they think about things, is that for some people it represents this particularly bad reason. Certainly in Germany, in the immediate post-war period, the fact that Hitler was rather like classicism meant that classicism was a kind of no-no. So all the beauty in classicism was affected by their political attitudes. So the idea of beauty is not free from political attitudes. Equally, how people looked in the 19th century, or even the 20th century, how people looked at what we would loosely call ethnic art, which we now regard commonly as very beautiful. Actually, largely, we have to thank Picasso for that, and thank for something. But of course, we have the social Darwinism and the idea that primitive art was primitive, and actually it was part of a progression that would lead to what we now know as kind of Western art. And so it was ethnic. It was a part of a progression. So it was interesting and it was curious, but it was actually something that led to a kind of more, I use the word carefully, civilized attitude of beauty. I'm not saying that myself. This is an idea that you quoted. Interestingly, Edwin Lutyens, and this is in India, was sent off to India to produce large numbers of buildings for the final days of the British Raj. And he was actually told to make his buildings kind of Indian. He didn't have a great deal of time for Indian art. This is one of many quotes, a monotonous riot of nonsense. Of course, we now regard these things as quite beautiful. I certainly do. I was at this building about a week ago. So, again, our cultural attitudes do affect how we look at things as being beautiful. And again, so the issue is, if that was happening now, well, maybe it's still happening. I want to go into a rather important point next, is one of the problems in discussing this is fashion and taste. And where does fashion and taste, and where do they belong together? And people say, well, fashion is just ephemeral, doesn't really matter. and it's not really about beauty, it's just kind of stuff, you know, that you do and it changes. I have a problem with this. I put a framework on it, which it's not an exact framework, but it comes from Fernand Braudel in the Annales School, and this is saying the only problem I had to resolve was that time moves at different speeds. Is that certain aspects of things that we regard as beautiful, my point previously is that they go in and out. I mean, it's not an absolute, it's cultural. They move at different speeds. So there was a time on the left when people that dressed like that were considered to be rather beautiful or possibly handsome. Not anymore, or maybe you do. I'll take a reserve view. So that actually passed very quickly, thankfully. So we're talking about événement, the events. So this is the Braudel, the Annales school of the different pace at which history moves. And the middle one is what is pejoratively called in Britain now brown furniture, which is Georgian furniture, basically. This was very highly regarded, really from about 1920, up until quite recently. I mean, I have a lot of this stuff, which is a real pain actually, because it's not worth anything now. But actually, in that period from 1920 to about 2020, so about 100 years, this was regarded as really the great stuff. And I mean, it is great stuff. I know I've got lots of it, and I paid a lot of money for it. But that's at a different pace. That's moved at a different pace. So the people's attitudes as to whether this is beautiful have changed. My children really don't like it, so I can't leave it to them, which is another problem. And on the right, longue durée, which now is often summarized as durée, longue durée, in analyst terms was kind of geology. This is Greek architecture. Now, Greek architecture was not always highly regarded. Probably got about a 250-year history of it being highly regarded. And there was a great debate with Piranesi particularly, and Robert Adam, my namesake, at the end of the 18th century, as to whether Greek architecture is primitive and you should kind of ignore it, and it was Roman architecture that was important. So these attitudes to what is beautiful or attractive, or whatever you want to call it, it moves at different paces. Like most things in the way we operate, moves at different paces. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's quite a useful one. So I just want to deal with that one and kind of get it out of the way, because the taste one always comes up. Now, this is now I'm going to go into something which I think was discussed earlier, and I'm going to use Teufel and social identity theory and Bourdieu and cultural capital and kind of move them together. I don't know if you can read the caption at the top right, but the idea somehow that well, I'll go to Teufel first, is that Teufel was a refugee, if you like, from the Nazi, from the Nazi the Nazi Party, and what happened before the war, during the war. And so he's very interested in this idea that people naturally divided themselves up into in-groups and out-groups. And I think it's moderately accepted now that this is a natural tendency. People form groups with which they identify themselves and prop themselves up. And in order to do this, they have an out-group. They have another one. And that you combine this with cultural capital is the idea that as a superior person, you will somehow have a more sophisticated view of things, and that will give you cultural esteem. That will give you literally cultural capital, the great thing about Bourdieu. I love this cartoon at the top, because actually this summarizes it just perfectly, The main point is that the people hate it, because if they hate it, that makes you a superior person. So I think then, and here I'll quote Roger, I think, through our aesthetic choices, we make signals to the world, and that means the world of others, and also ourselves as a part of that world. So in engaging in cultural capital, in saying there's certain things I like and certain things I don't like, I appreciate obscure authors as a contrary to popular authors, or I like difficult art. That gives me cultural capital. That makes me a superior person. So a lot of this was discussed earlier, actually. I've chosen my version of this. This is Jack Vetriano, which this is a painting he painted in 1992. and on the left is a painting by Stanley Whitney, who's called an icon of contemporary abstraction. I chose in particular, they were painted at the same date. I mean, Jack Verciano is deeply despised by the architectural establishment. In fact, this is the critique done in The Guardian, not even an artist. He just happens to be popular with, note the quotes, ordinary people. So ordinary people are kind of sort of, they're the out group. And Stanley Whitney, the irony of this is, and this is about, we talked about risk earlier. Well, Jack Verciano certainly risked being despised by the art establishment. In fact, but interesting enough, he laughed all the way to the bank because he sold 1 million copies of this, and it sold of the highest value painting sold in Scotland for £750,000. So, okay, so he ran one risk, but he cashed in. And of course, he was criticised because he copied some of these things. Well, actually, so did Renaissance artists. I mean, copying, unfortunately, is not a definition of something being bad. And interesting enough, the critic, and this is an interesting one, apropos of the thing we had earlier, is the critic said the real problem with Jack Verciano is what we need is education, education, education. This should be the watchwords of Britain's art world. So my God, if you like this, you've got to be educated out of it. I like the thing on the left, and the trouble is, the real dilemma of this is if everybody likes it, then unfortunately that gives you a problem with being an in-group and out-group. So you end up having to like something different. So anyway, that's a slightly logical problem. So, and back to literature again, which we talked about earlier, is who knows Danielle Steele? Danielle Steele has written 200 books. She's the best-selling author of all time. 800 million copies. Now, the issue with this, I think, is interesting. We can take views about whether Jack Verciano is kitsch or whether Stanley Whitney is a proper artist. I mean, I'm not going to go into that. But clearly the people that bought The Singing Butler and handed in it, they thought they get pleasure out of this. Now, they believe it's beautiful. Now, I don't know, do I tell them it's not beautiful? Do I? Or am I a superior person and tell them, no, I'm sorry, this is not beautiful, you shouldn't be liking this, don't buy it. So it's an interesting problem. If you stand back from this and imagine you're a future artistic historian, clearly, in any sociological terms, Jack Verciano's work is very important. It tells you something about contemporary society. It tells you, you raised the issue just now about the economics, looking into the economics of this. If you look at what I call, actually not bad paintings, I'll quickly switch to what I think is a good painting, because I don't want to hold a candle for Jack Verciano, because I'm a superior person. And so I'll go to David Legar, who actually I think probably is a bit more respectable. But if you actually take the amount of money that is spent, the value of what we call high art, or the art that the in-group have, or the superior people have, as against all those really quite good watercolours, quite good prints, that are sold out there in the provinces and so on and so on. I reckon that those have a higher cash value in aggregate than these important works. I don't know. It's an interesting piece of research to be done. So you can either look at it as saying, well, I'm sorry, this is not art. I wouldn't say that about David Legar, by the way, but back to, it's not art. But it does have a social significance. And so are we to tell all the people that like these things, is it's not beautiful? Well, not really. We're just saying it's beautiful to them, and we're another group who think it's beautiful. So let's go to architecture. Because that's kind of where I come from. So on the left is a modernist house, and I'm absolutely sure that the person that designed that thought it was really great. And I'm sure the person that commissioned it thought it was really great. On the right is a pretty crap speculative house. And that was built because the developer knew very well that people who buy houses, broadly speaking, want traditional houses, and they didn't really know what they were doing, so that was what they did. And I'm sure the person that bought that thought it was absolutely beautiful because it got a portico on it. We're in the same field. I very quickly shift off that because I don't want to support the house on the right. And to one of my few only buildings that are mine, because it must be good because I designed it. The same issue applies. Now, the issue is, the real issue with that is that, is my building beautiful? Don't vote on this. is that actually the people who bought the building on the other one could have had a better building. And the problem is that and they probably regard it as beautiful, they probably spend a lot of money on it, they live in it, it symbolises a lot of things. It is home, by the way, symbolises a lot of things for them. The problem is that the people who were involved with high art, which are basically, the in-group, quite like modernism, they're not going to address that. They're not going to give people something better that they regard as beautiful. I'll come back to that. I think that's a very important issue, actually. So, actually, there's quite a lot of research being done on this. I'm not terribly fond of putting a text on the screen so you can read it. I hope you can read it. It's a lot of research. It comes up with basically the same stuff. Is that architects think one load of things are beautiful and everybody else doesn't. Or architects and what I call fellow travellers, to use a communist thing, is that there are a group of people who actually belong to this coterie of superior people who actually know what it should be, and they're architects and they're fellow travellers, and other people don't. And there's a lot of research been done on this. This is a piece of research I commissioned where we asked the question backwards and forwards. Very important to ask when you're doing surveys, is to ask the question different ways. Roughly the same result is that old styles are right for new houses, 64%. New houses should not imitate old houses, only 23%. So it came up with a reason. This is quite a long time ago this was done. Interesting enough, in Britain in 2004, the Commission for the Architecture of the Built Environment, which was a government body populated by people, I was on it actually, but populated by superior people like me, mostly who were modernists, and I was a kind of Uncle Tom of the traditional movement. They came up with this research, quite difficult to see because they've been stretched. But the lacuna and the tapoli, lacuna is sort of vaguely traditional, tapoli is definitely traditional. Guess what? Most people liked it. And most people, this is, I would say like, and I'll use my word carefully, but they thought it beautiful enough to buy. They didn't like this research. They put it in a drawer and decided to forget about it. But my old firm decided to, kind of accepted, most of the architectural profession sort of accepted that, okay, it's housing. It's kind of that stuff we don't dirty our hands with anyway. So, they can have that crap. What's really important are public buildings, and people think differently about those. So we thought we'd try it out. And we went to Ipsos Mori, went to a proper research firm, and this was the text they asked us for, and we very carefully researched. Every building's the same height, same distance back edge of pavement, same number of people in it, reduced all the variables. The two modernist buildings were serious award winners, the others weren't. Well, actually, one's in Germany and one's in Britain. And the result was this. Same basic thing. Now, so just, moving on to this whole issue of there are two groups of what people think are beautiful here in architecture. There's a group of people who have decided that there is something which is important for the future of its time, argument terminology. And then there's everybody else, or pretty much everybody else. And it comes out in the competitions. There are two major international competitions. One is the Pritzker Prize, and a lot of those quotations I got from you earlier about which were sort of subversions of, minor versions of, or different ways of traditional, actually came from the Pritzker Prize. They now use the word beautiful. And there's a Driehaus Prize, which is specifically for traditional buildings. The RIBA does exactly the same. I'm currently trying to persuade the RIBA that they might include traditional buildings. That's the third time I've tried to do it in 15 years, and they don't want to know. So, again, this basic thing. Now, interestingly, I quote Roger again, in aesthetic judgment, we are suitors for agreement. So whose agreement? So is this an agreement of people who like traditional things, or this is the agreement of people who don't like traditional things and they are a superior group because they don't? So the issue, I'll get to an important thing, is that this is about how you deal with people generally and how you describe things. So if I say to somebody, actually, I think that's really beautiful, I kind of assume in saying that they sort of agree with me. Otherwise, I'd have to say, well, I think it's beautiful, you may not. But generally, people don't do that. they actually think that they actually belong to a group of people that have a broadly similar view. And this is very important. But you have to remember that with the in-group, in-group and out-group, they can swap places, of course, is the in-group that controls this is architects and their fellow travellers. So these are, I won't read them all out, you can read them, but you have to know the code words here. Pastiche means traditional, innovative and contemporary mean modernist, and these are all official documents. These are all means by which you get permission. So the lunatics have taken over the asylum. So basically, the in-group have made absolute, because this actually goes to Robert Travers' theory on punishing out-groups, in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. Absolutely clear. This is what happens in our planning system in Britain, and other countries as well, actually. I just happen to know Britain rather better. And here we are. On the top we have a kind of, excuse my English terminology, a bog standard speculative estate, and it's produced by people who have to make money out of houses, and so they're not going to produce houses people don't want to buy, and so it's sort of loosely traditional. And here we have Nans Leiden, and done by Hugh Petter, largely in my former firm. The Duchy of Cornwall sells extremely well. This is a better be careful about this. This is a better version. This is where people have actually gone to produce something good, better, I'll be careful with my terminology, that satisfies the same basic issue. And on the right we have similar sorts of schemes, but interesting enough, they win awards. Because the awards are actually given by the establishment, by the in-group. And I just want to dwell, dealing with Roger, and actually this is an important point raised earlier, is that Roger has had this goes away from debating things to the real world. Michael Gove, who is our Secretary of State, a minister, basically, was a great admirer of Roger. And this is his speech in July this year, setting up the Office of Place. So the first time communities have been able to demand from developers what they find beautiful and banish what they find ugly. So actually the government now in Britain is very clear. And the other thing is that they're building beautifully. And the Office of Place is set up as a government committee, which we're both very familiar. So actually, this is a very interesting case of let's call it, academic philosophy having a significant effect on government and our built environment. And this may happen elsewhere, maybe only Britain, I don't know. But it is in many ways remarkable. It will probably survive a changing government, because I think it's a very difficult government that says, I want to produce buildings that people don't like, and I want them to have things that are ugly. But in fact, actually, that's what the system currently produces very often, not necessarily, but very often. I'm not quite sure where I put this one in. I think it was just to illustrate one of my own buildings on the right. But this was, so here we have this basic dichotomy. These are left is a firm by a very successful firm, Allies and Morrison. They're both friends of mine. I have to say I'm friends with these people. I don't regard them as intrinsically evil. They're nice people. They're just misguided. These are the two worlds we live in. Bob Allies, a good friend. Hugh Petter's just produced a book of his work, and Bob Allies has refused to endorse it because he's terribly worried about being associated with something from the out-group, which is currently what we are. So I'm probably running out of time. I know what I'm doing. 10 minutes? Probably less. We'll see how I get on. How much I can talk for a long time. So I'm going to go back to some interesting issues now. This is slightly, anyway, let's move on. These are three categories by which I, in this book, which you're all going to rush out and buy, is defining tradition, the key things about tradition. Now, this is not an exact parallel, but it turned out to be quite useful in a way, because actually it's kind of broadly fits. Again, I'll quote Roger, is that aesthetic judgment plays a part in shaping a real and living community by enlisting the cooperation of others in the building of a shared environment. And when we talk about home, be careful to talk about home. Home is not just sitting in your house and shutting the door. Home is a place. And it's your neighborhood, your town, or possibly even your country. But home is a place. It's not just a house. And so one of the things, I say, if you're saying to somebody, if you're sharing the idea of what is beautiful, in what is, it's not exact. I mean, people can like and dislike things, but there's a broad consensus of this, which we kind of know about. That is something, the way you're defining home. So it's very clear. So this top Hindu building is in Nottingham, in English Midlands, where there's a very large Hindu community. And so, and you'll notice there's a kind of shed behind it. So there's a very clear community identity with this. So the Hindu community in this part of Nottingham will very clearly identify with this and find a beauty that represents home, because home for them, that's what that is. And at the bottom is by Duncan Stroik, is a new monastery, which, again, the Catholic community identifying with very specific references here. So this is effectively the community identifying with itself. And always careful about moral judgments and beauty, and some people have already decided that truth or whatever it is you should separate it. This is one place where moral judgment really does come in. Because the thing about architecture, I mean, if you looked at paintings, you don't have to have them. You don't have to turn up to a gallery if you don't want to. You don't even have to read a book if you don't want to, unless you're at school. And however, as Roger says here, the architect must build in such a way that things look right, not just to himself, but the public as a whole. And I actually think this is a moral issue. If people broadly find something beautiful, you shouldn't be producing something that they find ugly. And what you should be doing is providing something that is better. I mean, you actually can. So as we look at the speculative housing, if you do it badly, it's not great, but it's what people want. You can do it well. So you should do it well. I actually believe it's a strong moral issue. But community identity cuts different ways. The in-group also have a community identity. So here we have the Barcelona Pavilion, which is actually a facsimile from 1929, which I don't like to admit. It was reconstructed in 1986, so it's a fake. But it is one of the most influential buildings of this particular in-group. And you can see it here. So we have Philip Johnson's Booth House of 1946 on the left. We have Richard Horden on the left in Britain in 1975. This is now a protected building. And on the bottom right, we have Golden Bay, New Zealand, which won an award in 2017. And the top is a building which has actually not been built yet, but is currently here. So, they're not the same, but, if you're an architect, if you're part of this group, you recognize this as a type. And these always win awards. I mean, a developer, a client of mine said, I know how to win an award. You just produce a thing that looks like a shoebox and put glass down one side, and the architectural profession will give you an award. It's kind of broadly correct. This is a different group. Let's be clear about it. Is that this particular group find these things beautiful? They don't. Other people don't. So these are different groups of people finding things beautiful. I'm not going to deny that they find it. And I have to say, I'm kind of, tainted with being part of this group. I do find the Barcelona Pavilion quite beautiful in certain ways. There's I'm not running around saying this is ugly, you ought to pull it down. I think it's a rather more complex issue. But I think that to deny the other group what they believe to be beautiful and not try and improve it is something I shouldn't be doing. The other one is it needs to be identifiable. That's a quite interesting issue, actually. And the idea is that the beauty can't be hidden, which has come up several times. Well, the point is, there is a theory out there that said, actually, quite a well-known architect said to me, well, I do tradition, but it's hidden. And I said, well, it can't be tradition if it's hidden, because nobody knows it's there. And then one thing you have to do about tradition is know it's there. So it's a way that these are ways in which the community identify. Actually, there's another one of my buildings on the right, which is in Beirut. I think it's still there. And the one on the left is by Hugh Petter. And they have very specific things in them which give a very clear identity. So people looking at these, and the one in Beirut, it has a very specific character related to Beirut, and the one on the left is actually the oval, which has got a very large version of the ashes urn at the top and various other things. So there are, the good thing, these are things that make very clear identity. So say that broad group that find these kind of things beautiful, identify with them. It's very straightforward. You can't make it into some abstraction like a golden section and say, look, I'm going to produce this sort of bizarre building, but say the golden section, say it must be beautiful, so you've got to like it. It doesn't work like that. But the other group, of course, have exactly the same issue. And this is the Nanjing Youth Cultural Centre 2014 by Zaha Hadid. I mean, I don't find this particularly beautiful, to be perfectly honest, but there are lots of people that do, and I'm sure the late Zaha Hadid thought it was really beautiful. But the point is that that particular group of people do find this beautiful. We'd be wrong to deny it. The other one is gets a little bit more sketchy, actually, because, and this is, but I'll cover it, because these are the three categories of what makes things traditional. The other thing is continuity. I say real or constructed, because the Fisherman's Bastion in Budapest is end of the 19th century. It's a kind of Gothic revival or national romanticism, whatever you want to call it. But nonetheless, it's convincing enough. The truth is that on the whole, I think most people involved with these things understand, is that, let's call it the public appreciation of things, it doesn't go through revolutionary processes. I mean, most people don't wander around thinking, no, do I think this is beautiful this week? No, it's next week, I've got to think something else. They just don't do that. They don't spend all their time worrying about that kind of thing. And why should they? They're just normal people. They're more worried about their mortgages and the trouble their children are getting into. So these things tend to move fairly slowly. As we said, this is possibly not quite longue durée, probably a venement. So the idea that actually it will change. These things do change, as I said earlier. It will change, but they change fairly slowly. So, but the same applies to the other group. This is the middle is the famous Mies van der Rohe glass tower that never happened, and there's a building in Germany, which there's no question that the architects, because Mies van der Rohe is so famous, is that the architects who did this building will have been aware of this. And so this is a signal, if you like. This is a continuity. But Mies van der Rohe is 1921. I mean, this is 100 years old. See, this gets the word of modernity, which I have a big problem with. This is not modern by the normal sense of the word. This is a very old idea. I think modernism is a more useful term. Modernity is confusing, as is the word contemporary. And they're deliberately confusing. People have moved away from saying modernism to saying modern because it gives you the idea that it is inevitable that you're going to be like this. And on the right is Walter Gropius in 1925. Again, this is 100 years old, and a bin house in Vietnam, which is 100 years later. These are the continuity is there. The definition of tradition is 3 generations. Well, this is definitely it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's 3 generations. So, I mean, I find that quite useful. They kind of fit in a way with the definition of tradition. But I don't want to push that one too much. I discovered it's a neat fit, but nonetheless, the principle that the communities identify with certain things by believing that they're beautiful, I think is there. And I'll just finish off with this is sorry. Go back. This is one of the many surveys which you find on the internet. I put in most beautiful buildings, and this is done by some travel firm, a sort of poll, and this was the top 10 beautiful buildings. Interesting. I mean, it's not particularly valid survey. Interesting, when you go into it, most of the ones you find are things like the buildings by Zaha Hadid, because they're clearly done by architects. So there's no question, if you actually look into this on the internet, that when you actually go to different definitions of what is beautiful, and specifically using those words, you will find things like the Gherkin in London, or buildings in the Middle East by Norman Foster. So there's no question that as to whether they really are beautiful is a complex point which we've been discussing, but you can't possibly deny that the people who actually came up with these definitions or built them thought they were beautiful. So we have different people thinking different things are beautiful under different circumstances. So I'll stop with that because A, time's run out, and B, you've probably heard enough. And so thank you. Oh, by the way, that's my book, which has lots more of this in it. And so I'm sure it's a copy there, you can peruse it. And which you'll rush out and buy. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I will go straight to the floor for questions. One very eager one here.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That was very, very interesting. A lot to get through, and there was quite a few sections to your. Do I need a microphone or my? Yeah, my audio. Anyway. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how some of the sections of the presentation connect. So this is how I'll contextualize my question. So I want to push back against the idea that modernist architects believe that their buildings are beautiful. And if they do, and they use that term to express that claim, should we reconsider what they mean or intend by beauty? And then this relates to the initial section of your presentation, which seemed to maybe, but you tell me, draw a broad connection between the human body and beauty somehow. Maybe, and you soon went into the golden section, and maybe you were actually trying to reject the idea that there's this connection between the human body and beauty. But the idea I'm moving towards is that maybe classical beauty has a specific content, has a specific phenomenology. It relates maybe to certain ideas. Think of Kant's aesthetic ideas or Hegel's idea that beauty is an expression of freedom, which obviously relates to the body, and classical sculpture being the apex of Western art from that 19th century German perspective. So you arrive at a conception of beauty which has quite a cluster of concrete content. And if we have that idea of beauty in place, it then seems very difficult to reapply that conception of beauty to many of the modernist buildings that you showed, and then that makes me wonder if modernist architects do really mean the same thing that they mean when they have an experience of a sunset versus an experience of their own building. And then just to conclude, I think it's quite a telling point that most or lots of modernist architects live in Georgian townhouses. So at the end of the day, they return to a classical building. That's it.
Point first, some do, some don't.
Yeah, I know, but it's funny that they do.
The now king and the Prince of Wales used to often ask about where they lived, and I live in you bloody hypocrite. And but no, I'll dismiss that. Some do, some don't.
Yeah, I know it's a bit.
And so the 2 points there. Human body is tricky, I think. I do think there's mileage in let's call it evolutionary theory. I mean, I think it has other aspects. I think there are other aspects to it. I thought about place, about nature, about connection with nature in one form or another, about intimacy, about complexity. I mean, it's a whole area of research which I haven't really engaged in. I think just sticking to the human body, you end up talking about proportions, and that gets quite tricky. It's a hidden thing. So, I got these proportions of the human body, so I can put them on a building. So you're supposed to be able to work that out. It makes it beautiful. Don't quite go there, actually. I think there is mileage in evolutionary theory in this. I think we're slightly cautious about making it too literal, but nonetheless, I think probably in place more than that. There is someone called Suzanne Sussman in the States that reckons that all modernist architects are autistic. I think that's pushing it a bit. Or that they had shell shock or post-traumatic stress syndrome. Pretty tenuous, frankly. But I think I have a problem, really, in denying who someone... I mean, so these are friends of mine, be clear about this. I don't sit in a sort of in a classical camp and put a wall around. And I mean, I've involved myself in the architectural profession throughout my career more broadly, and these are decent, honourable people who think they're doing a good thing. Now, why they think they're going to do the thing won't deny, it's a whole other issue. So I'd be very cautious about saying, I know you think it's beautiful, but it isn't, because they say, yes, it is, no, it isn't, you don't get anywhere on that one. So you end up with what we talked about a lot, is defining what tradition actually is. Well, if we go back to what Roger's saying, Roger actually saying is that it is something that's defined by the community, which I broadly believe. Now, but the point is, this is a community. You know, there is a story that if you ever want to shut sociologists up, you simply put them in a room and ask them to define community. They'll never come out. You know, I'm afraid communities exist in various forms. I mean, you know, my wife's book club is a community, and the country I live is in a community. So, but nonetheless, the communities identify them in different ways. I would find it very difficult to go up to someone and say, you think it's beautiful, I don't think you're right, it's not. They say, yeah, okay, that's your problem, not mine. I wouldn't say, you are wrong to think it's beautiful. I'd have to come up with a very, very precise and concise definition of what beauty is, which I don't think any of us have actually reached, to come to that view. I think it's more useful to think that, you know, that there are, you know, that they belong to, if you like, a group that seizes social capital by being different. Or by being superior, because they'll do with superior things, and therefore, in my education, after education, that's what I was taught. I was taught that I will belong to a superior group by becoming an architect, because my taste will be better than everybody else's. That's what I was taught. So I'm very cautious about going to somebody who thinks something is beautiful and saying, no, it's not, you're wrong. I don't know where I go with that.
Paul, I've got you next in the queue.
Sorry, where's Paul?
That was mostly my question, but I think we could get a little bit more mileage. Recently, Dawkins and Brett Weinstein had a debate on evolution, going over some of the current debates, and they touched on beauty, because Weinstein said one area where there's been no progress in evolutionary biology since the 1960s is getting anywhere on beauty. But we don't know why it is that male peacocks are attractive to females, other than just the obvious part. But we can't get to why. So this does seem to be the white whale, actually getting to what beauty is. So I think you've answered this, but any more you could give on arguments that have persuaded anyone or opened their minds a bit more that there is this thing that we're after, and even if we can only go so far as the Supreme Court did in defining obscenity, which is I know it when I see it. I mean, is there something that we can try and approximate to convince people of beauty? Because it seems to me if we're relying only on the kind of community standard, we have the problem that you just mentioned. How do we define community? And also, what happens when the community prefers things that, if we know it when we see it, are damned ugly? So, any further mileage we can get on, like, approximating it?
Well, let's get the peacock argument, because there's a particular peacock evolutionary argument that is, peahens don't actually find it beautiful, they just find it a very useful signal that it's a healthy peacock. The theory goes, it's runaway evolution. It's a very interesting theory. Is that the first peahen and the first peacock, no first one, theoretical first one. The first peacock had a healthy peacock had a slightly bushy tail, and so the peahen chose the one with a slightly bushy tail. So the next generation, they all had slightly bushy tails. So to pick a good one, it had to have a slightly bushier tail than all the other, and so it goes on. It's called runaway evolution. It's a well-known phenomenon in the peacock's example. So the idea that we find the peacock beautiful for very particular reasons, I mean, it's quite difficult to put it on a peahen, frankly. And evolution, it's very interesting, and I think, Nicholas Boyd-Smith and I had a discussion about this the other day, and I said, I'm going to say that, you know, there are no constants in this. And he said, well, I think there are. And in a way, he's possibly right, but it's about place. It's very difficult to get too specific about it. I remember I went to a talk once where somebody had done very careful research into what happened by tracing eye movement, but what happened when people saw natural environments. And she said, well, they always look in the shade first. And it never occurred to her that on an evolutionary basis, that's what you do, because you can't see what's in there and it might be dangerous. Now, that may or may not be right, but I do think there's more mileage in this. I think things like complexity. If everything there's no complexity, I think we find that disturbing. I don't know why. I mean, more work's needed on it. Intimacy, and safety. All of these things, they probably have. Well, we do know, in other ways. I mean, we wouldn't be sexually attracted unless there was an evolutionary process behind that, because actually it's the only reason we're all here. So we do know this exists, but as I say, I think it's a very difficult thing to be very specific about. We can be general about it. But what Nicholas Boyd Smith has found in his research is that across cultures, there are certain things which tend to come out. And I think it's a fruitful area for research, but not one that I've done. So I think the other thing is I go back to the issue, is that the other thing about community is you have to find which community. And broadly speaking, that's not too difficult. If you've got a town or a village or something like that, or a neighbourhood, I mean, the community's there, it's not terribly difficult. And it's not terribly difficult to ask them. You've got to be careful what you ask. And that is currently built into British government policy, that you should ask. I mean, how you ask is a whole other issue. So I know there are lots of different versions of community, but there are communities that live in places, and they don't tend to move very often.
I'm going to abuse my chair's privileges. Do you find it easier to build intersubjective agreement about urban form than you do about architecture? So when it gets down to like facade pattern, one quite often feels you reach the point where it's quite hard, further argument's quite difficult, and we kind of reach an impasse here. Whereas when you're looking at, does this street network work, does this block pattern work, does this treatment of the public space work, like those truths maybe are more widely accepted. There doesn't seem that much cultural variation about them. Even your modernist colleagues now will basically accept this stuff, right? So they didn't in the 50s. But
I think it's what I call contextual urbanism, or sometimes call it new urbanism, some traditional urbanism. It's become the predominant urban theory. I mean, most people give lip service to it. I mean, it certainly wasn't the case in the 60s and some part of the 70s. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty widely accepted. I have to say, I went to a talk, actually it was one of my trip to Libya, where someone from Norman Foster's office gave a talk about what they were doing in Benghazi, and I thought, this is amazing. This is exactly what I would have said. And then I looked at the buildings, and they were all glass wall buildings built on a wide street grid. So a lot of people talk about it. But no, I think that's right, and it's an easier argument to make. The interesting thing is how terribly worked up, I mean, quite reasonably, architects and other people get with the facade of a building. And facade is, like a lot of words we use, they have it's interesting that they have a relationship with our body. Facade is a face, and front is this is an interesting theory that almost all our etymology comes from our form and our relationship with our environment. But facade is the one we use, and people get very concerned about it, and quite reasonably, because people buy places because they express, that facade expresses who they are, and it is quite well established. And I have this debate very often with other architects, because if you have a terraced house or row house, it's about 6 or 7 meters wide, and it's about 5 meters high, and all the rest of it's the same. There's only 2 ways you can put a stair up, and there's only 2. You can only get a room in the front and a room at the back, and they're all the same. But everyone's incredibly worked up about this 6 or 7 meter thing, but this 5 meter thing, and you think, well, come on, guys. But actually, it is important because actually this is the way people live in it. It's interesting with apartments or flats, it's quite different. Because it's a communal thing, and actually the important thing is the thing you go into. But for houses, it is important. But you're right. I mean, and as how right or wrong it is at the end of the day. But in one sense, it is the mean, new urbanism or contextual urbanism is the predominant architectural theory, urban design theory at the moment, and very widely shared.
Gentleman here was next. Yeah. Thank you. If you in your audience, do you want to sort of signal to me, I can put you down on my list.
Thank you, Robert. That was great. I think I would agree with you. Certainly, there are modernist buildings that are beautiful, and often it's not the building itself that's the problem. It's where they're placed, right? If they're placed next to something which breaks totally with the style, then it doesn't work. Also, I think it's a problem that most people would prefer, when pressed, they would prefer a traditional building. We've actually done numbers in Oslo, in Norway, with a serious pollster that found that 70% of the population will prefer traditional buildings. And we have this architectural uproar, which tries to correct the fact that almost none of the public buildings or big commercial developments use traditional forms, so that's sort of the discrepancy between what the public wants and what the government does. So I wonder if have you come across any, sort of on the, what is a community? Have you come across any society where there have been rules about allowing democracy to rules, neighborhoods or towns or nations? Is there a good role model that we could find to enforce democracy in these kind of cases?
Well, actually, currently that's what the British government's trying to do. And in fact, I have to say that seminal is very closely involved with this.
I am but a passive vessel through which the ideas of others flow.
Come now, stop being modest. I think the British government, but the interesting thing about it, and this is, I think, odd enough, there are various kinds of survey that people do. There's a motherhood and apple pie survey, which says, is motherhood good and is apple pie tasty? And you always say yes. And there's another one, as a lawyer, who's closely involved with this. I think he has a mug, which he uses in the office, which says this, that most public consultation is called patronise and ignore. And you ask the right questions and you get the right answers. No, but the British government is trying to introduce this. And it's very specific, actually. It's actually written into policy. The real issue is how it is perverted and used in different ways. Quite tricky. I mean, Sammy could probably talk about this more than I could. Is how you go about this and how you interpret it. I'll give you an example. Sarah and I are both involved in the Office of Place and the government producing, who commissioned, paying a number of local authorities to come up with codes. And the codes have to be derived from what is popular. Well, a particular new town, which I got involved myself in this stage, they did this. They did a very efficient survey. I mean, the survey was very good. And what they discovered was that everyone liked the old town and not the new town. Big surprise. So what they did was they said, well, what do the public really mean? What they really mean is they like brickwork. Well, isn't what they said. So they think they've asked people, and they say, what they really want is decorated brickwork. So we produce modernist buildings decorated brickwork. So it's a complicated issue, and how you actually extract it and how you deal with it is subject. Another thing, they commissioned another set of these codes, which probably I think I mean 17 and 20 something, about 30 to 40% of them included stylistic provisions, saying they should be innovative or contemporary. Some of those quotations I showed up there were from those. They just can't stop themselves. They just can't help themselves. They've just got to, because it's the sort of punishment of the outgroup problem. Basically you've just got to stop the other stuff, and you've got to have your stuff done. It's an absolute reaffirmation of your group. So it's a complex problem. But certainly in Britain, it is actually part of government policy, and it is being actively advanced at the moment.
Thank you.
Sir?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. My question is this: how do we reconcile this minister's proclamation in July that the people should be consulted, the communities consulted on the harmony, et cetera, and what they want? In other words, the people are the arbiters of architectural taste, the outgroup. And how do we reconcile that with the 50 million Kincaids in American households.
So with this, sorry,
The 50 million Kincaid's paintings that the general public likes.
oh, well, that's an interesting point, because I think, you know, I'm not going to, you know, I mean, I kind of, as you probably noticed there, I had a slight problem with the issue of kitsch. I mean, I'm sufficiently a member of the out group to be able to find Jack Vetriano a bit of a problem. That's why I quickly switched the slide. As I've said, I think that people who are interested in this kind of thing, if you like to say this, people who believe that actually this public thing is important, it is their duty to produce something better. And okay, people may not accept it, but the example of the speculative house that I showed initially, I mean, it's junk, frankly. It's been produced by a builder. Now, the point about the builder is he needs to make money. And to make money, he's not going to produce something that people don't like. You know, absolutely fundamental. Slightly affected by the issue of shortage, but that's another story. Now, the thing is that what has happened is that the architectural profession has walked away from this and said, these bad taste people, we're not getting involved in this garbage. And the result of that, the quality has gone down. I mean, in the 1920s and 30s, Britain had a huge huge public building project, and actually the architecture was very good. And the architecture was very good because architects did it, because they were aesthetically trained. So I have a basic principle, which is that the architects who kind of disdain this kind of thing say, well, we're nothing to do with us. We didn't do it. I said, it is to do with you. It's Aristotle's helmsman. How can we be responsible for something not being there? The helmsman is responsible for what's there by not being at the helm. And so, if it's in a way, it's our duty, if you like, to at least offer something better, which is also acceptable. But to say it's garbage, I won't touch it, I've got to produce an enormous version of a balloon dog, or something totally revolutionary and bizarre, which is good because people don't like it. Don't forget, popular is actually a fairly standard pejorative term. So I think the answer to that is engage and actually move into that field and offer people, you can't force it on people, offer people something better.
Sorry. Sarah.
The real fashion thing is about the joke about I was just going to shout. It's the old-fashioned thing, I think, isn't it, about the old joke about making architects live in the houses they design. But your point about architects not walking away from that table is absolutely sound, because without that, to go to the 20s and 30s, what we have in the outskirts of London, for example, you see it as you go, in fact, you go on the bus from Oxford, if you take the Oxford Tube, London changes as you go from Victoria, out through Notting Hill, and then onto the Westway. You have substantially beautiful buildings in which normal people lived and continue to live, normal people doing normal things. What I find remarkable is how normal people no longer seem to have that accountability and relationship with government. That there's this people want to live, I'm quite convinced they want to live in nice houses. They want to live in aesthetically pleasing houses. And this is why I want to challenge Sam on this, because the government is trying to have this conversation with people about where they might want to live and what that might look like. But I'm trying to see at the moment how that's working out, and I would just love to hear from both of you, because I know we're both involved in it, from both of you how you think that's going, how close we are getting. I'm not going to say getting to utopia, because I don't think we're going to get there, but getting towards this realisation of Roger's vision of how beauty and architecture might finally return, not necessarily to the few, but also to the many.
I mean, there's one of the issues, one of the problems with this is the market. Because actually most countries in Europe, there's a structural shortage of housing. I mean, this will date me a bit. I say when you don't get a choice, you get a trabant. Is that if your primary object is getting hold of the product, then actually the detailed quality of the product becomes a lesser issue. I mean, interestingly, we're in Britain, we're currently entering a recession in the housing market. This is very severe. It's happening right now. And what happens when the market goes down is the quality of housing goes up, because the public have more choice, and they can be much more discerning about what they buy. But the other thing is you know, I said earlier, I mean, most people don't walk around wondering about how a Doric column fits onto an entablature. They just don't. They have a broad idea of what they find attractive and beautiful. I mean, as a traditional architect, I'm mortally offended when the abacus goes underneath the architrave. And this really annoys me because it's not necessary and it's basically wrong. But actually, most builders think I'm nuts, even thinking about it, and most people who buy the stuff don't really know. So my mission in this is to make sure the abacus always does, because then at least I get a better product. But I think that the important issue in this is that it's my job, and you're involved in architecture too, it's our job to look critically at these things. And most, I mean, ordinary, I carefully use the word ordinary because it's kind of pejorative, but most normal people, they don't spend their lives looking at buildings and wondering if the window proportions are right. They kind of know when they are, and they'll understand that there's something better and something worse. But the issue is that if what you're offering is always better, then their choice is always going to be better. I think the danger is and the earliest piece of research I was involved in a commission, we ran focus groups, and they were very interesting because I was deeply impressed by how perceptive ordinary members of the public were, not in detail about architectural detail, but about symbolism and about how these things are beautiful or not. So I think it's tricky because, you know, most buyers aren't going to worry about the abacus and the architrave. But if I worry about the abacus and the architrave, and they always get the abacus and the architrave in the right place, they'll get a better product. So it's my job to when they make that choice, not entirely informed, to give them something better.
3 cheers for that.
Time for one final question. If we, gentleman down here. Oh, unless there's. Oh no, Anthony, go on.
Oh yes,
Sorry.
I just want to make a very mild defence of the modernist architects about beauty. Perhaps beauty.
So you need to be closer onto the microphone.
Yeah, about beauty. Perhaps beauty isn't the right concept to be deploying, because you could easily say that very clear lines, plate glass, even nicely produced concrete, these things could, for a certain aesthetic, be beautiful. So the question is more not whether they're beautiful, in some sense of beautiful, and you know, I can also, up to a point, having lived in clutter, sympathise with Adolf Loos's claim that ornament is crime. You know, you might think to have a very white, clear-cut building, as Wittgenstein thought you should have, is going to produce something beautiful. The question is it fitting for living in or being surrounded by, which is slightly different from whether it's beautiful.
I do agree with you, actually. I mean, I am sufficiently embedded in my own profession to actually realise that the modernist buildings can be, in their own terms, beautiful. And I would absolutely defend anyone who's got a private plot, which not many people can see from anywhere, and building exactly what they want. There's a famous Richard Meyer house in Oxford, which actually local people call the filling station. But so I would absolutely defend people. I agree with you. I think actually there can be great beauty in clean lines. I spent 12 years of my life giving awards to modernist buildings. I'd say I was the Uncle Tom of the traditional movement, because I believe that if you actually view them in their own terms, you could actually reach that conclusion. I agree with you completely. It's if you stick that in a place where people it doesn't really work very well, or it destroys the setting in which it's in, or it doesn't produce a good living environment and overheats and so on. That's a whole other issue. But I've said all along is that I can't actually say to a modernist architect who is a decent, aesthetically minded person who thinks they're doing the right thing, that what they're doing isn't beautiful in spite of the fact they think it is. Because in their terms it is. It's easy to rubbish people in these things, but I just think you have to realise that. I mean, these people are. I keep saying this. These people are friends of mine, and I'm not. As I say, they're not bad people, and they're not non-aesthetic people. They're deeply aesthetic people. But you're right. It's about appropriateness, and it's about, if you're delivering something that you find beautiful to a group of people that don't find it beautiful, I don't think that's the right thing to do. But if you are, if you've got a big field and you want to build a modernist house in it, well, good luck to you. That's what you want. It's not affecting anybody. That's absolutely fine. And if you find that beautiful, well done. Good luck to you.
Robert, thank you so much. Join me.